just want to record the session as well. Okay, so we started with sampling last week, and I reached out to all of you asking for a few questions just to link what we covered with where you are currently in your own studies that you are busy developing, and sent responses throughout the week up until today, and hope that it guides you or helps you or perhaps gives you something to think about. And ultimately, you and your supervisor will sit and unpack that specific component to negotiate on what works, what doesn't work, because they've got probably a better glimpse into what your study is about holistically. But for me this evening, I want to just backtrack a bit, do a summary of where we left off, and then dive into hypotheses for this evening's discussion. Okay. Okay, I can't see my screen, so I'm going to ask that you indicate if you are able to, let me go back again. If you are able to see my screen, please, may you please indicate if you are.
Yes, we can see your screen. You are at Kahoot.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask that you hopefully have another device that you can interact with, just for us to run through, I think, 8 questions, summarizing where we left off last week and what more or less I'm trying to hint for you, questions that would help you to think about sampling for your specific study. So I'm going to ask, if possible, if you can please utilize an additional device, your cell phone, just to join in to answer a couple of questions based on sampling. I hope there's at least 2 of you that will join. Thank you so much, Noel. Going to hang in there and hopefully we get a few more responses. Appreciate it, Felicia. Thank you, Anna. Listen, hello, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Okay, I'm going to give it 1 more minute for anybody else who's willing to join in as we reflect on sampling from work we covered last week. And if you perhaps forgotten or you haven't joined in last week, you can still give it a shot. Just an informal way of us recapping what we have done. Okay.
Hi, Diana, it's Karen.
Yes, Karen?
We are just trying to, there's a WhatsApp group that's trying to work out which link to use to join this meeting, because it's not our usual classroom. It's not our usual Blackboard Collaborate classroom. So I think everyone's just battling to find where to click on the link.
If I may ask, why is it not the usual one?
Because on our Blackboard subject, on our module page, you click on Blackboard Collaborate and it goes to this is the classroom. That's not where we are right now. This link that you've got now is a different link that you gave us last week for last week's collab. And so they're all trying to, there they come. They're all trying to find the right place to click on this link. But it's not, it's not the dedicated classroom for this module.
Is it? Okay, I'll check. I'll look into that. Thank you for informing me.
Okay.
I'll just make a note. Okay, we've got, so for the students who are joining in, I'm gonna give it another minute or so then. If someone could just indicate for me if there are still people who are joining in, if there's still of your classmates who are coming, or more or less where we are now. Nosipo, we lost you. I'm going to give you a minute to come back. Let me just check who is. Karen, if you could maybe advise, may I continue on, or is there still a large group of students who are struggling?
Yeah, I think we might have one or two more, but I don't know how big of a group it is. So
Okay.
Zach Hassim has said that he isn't going to be attending. He's sending his apologies. Yeah, I'm not sure who else will still come on. I think we might as well start.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Okay, so we're going to start by recapping where we were last week with sampling, but through a informal Kahoot that is generally not so, shouldn't cause you any anxiety to participate or just to recap with us. So let's kick off and we can start. I will think of a nice reward that I can give the individual who wins this particular test today. So our first question is true or false? Probability sampling is best aligned with quantitative studies or research. What would you think your answer would be? Probability sampling is best aligned with quantitative. Okay, so if you refer to your textbook on page 152, you'd see that probability study is best aligned with quantitative studies because it includes where we want to almost generalize the data that we find. And so perhaps to give yourself some insight or clarity, look at the description on page 152 regarding probability sampling. And if you are doing a quantitative study, your description would be this probability sampling. I've chosen this particular sampling method that aligns with probability sampling. So please take note of that so that you don't say probability when you're doing qualitative. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. Well done, Felicia. I see you. Okay, the next one, simple random sampling. Simple random sampling, I've given you two options to choose from. Triangle, used in quantitative studies, and a diamond, when each element of the population has an equal chance of being selected. What do you think the correct answer would be? I try to trick you here. It is used in quantitative studies. However, in random sampling, we want the population that has an equal chance of being selected. So if we choose that random sample, everybody should have had a fair chance to be, or equal chance of being selected. Well done, Nawal. We'll move on. Convenient sampling. There's 4 options to choose from. It's generally used in qualitative studies. Participants are available for the researcher. It's the same as volunteer sampling, and it has no bias. Which option or options are most applicable for convenience sampling? Very good. It's generally used in qualitative studies, and the participants are available for the researcher. It's convenient for the researcher how to access them. Felicia's back on top. Let's see the next question. Stratified sampling. This is a probability sampling method. As a hint, the researcher divides the sample into groups called strata. The researcher assigns a counting number to every population member. The researcher selects members from each strata derived as a random sample. And you have, for example, 1 out of 1,000 that you can select as a random number. So they are correct as number 1. The researcher divides the sample into subgroups, and those are called strata, are random sampling. So those were the correct answer. So if you're doing a quantitative study, this could possibly be an option that you will consider. Okay, we're nearly done. Types of probability sampling are, and these are all the generally quantitative related sampling methods. Simple sampling, simple random sampling, snowball sampling, systematic sampling, and purposive sampling. Which ones are probability examples or quantitative examples? Very good. It's the first two. It's sampling, simple random sampling, and systematic sampling. Snowball would generally be qualitative. So let's do 2 more. Non-probability sampling is the best aligned with qualitative. Is this true or false? Okay, we have a maybe option here where half said yes and half said no. But if probability is quantitative, non-probability is not best aligned with qualitative, that is incorrect. It is best aligned with qualitative. So I try to trick you there. Hope that you see. Felicia, I see you. True or false? Accidental and volunteering sampling is examples of probability sampling. Are they examples of qualitative sampling? True or false? I'm not trying to trick you here. Accidental and volunteer sampling is examples of probability. It was of probability sampling. It was incorrect. Probability means quantitative, and these are examples of qualitative. So in essence, last question, true or false, you need to align your sampling method choice with your research questions and aims of the study to ensure that you're choosing the correct research method. You need to align your sampling method choice with your research questions and aims of your study. True or false? That's true. So you're going to have to consider all the sampling methods that we've covered, both probability and non-probability, and align which is best fit for your research questions and that aligns with the aims of your study in its entirety. So just to recap, probability samples are aligned with quantitative studies primarily. So if you have a quantitative study, you needed to consider techniques such as on page 154, simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. If you have a quantitative study, that is generally where you would lean towards. If you have a qualitative study, your choices would fall from page 159, where it's non-probability, and your options are accidental sampling, convenience sampling, quota sampling, snowball sampling, volunteer sampling, and perp sampling. So please take note between the two so you can distinguish between which one is for a qualitative study, which one is for a quantitative study. And if you're doing mixed method, then you have the option to, or experimental design, you have the option to choose options from both probability and non-probability sampling. In order for you to understand and link it back to your study, you're going to have to do some reading. But I would say if you know if you've got qualitative, you would align it best with the non-probability options. And if you've got a quantitative study, you would align it with qualitative. We have a winner this evening, Felicia, and 2 runners-up. I see you. Thank you for attempting it and for giving it a shot this evening, Felicia, I'll send you something I can reward you with in the week. You'll receive it via email. Okay, so I'm going to leave this particular site and go back to my slides for this evening, or perhaps I should just check back on the chat. But to give Felicia a round of applause, let me stop sharing for a bit. I just want to come back to the chat. Well done, Felicia, you're on the right track, and even from the email that I've seen, the engagement that you're giving, you're quite committed to your study. I foresee in your future you're going to connect the theory to practice, and you're going to come up with an awesome study. So well done, and thank you for the effort to participate in playing the game. Okay, so I'm going to go back to what we are actually meeting for this evening, and that is to touch on or check in regarding hypotheses. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my slides. Okay, so this evening in your textbooks, if you could please refer to chapter 6 for me. And generally, when we look at it, you're going to see when it is applicable for your study or not. But it doesn't mean that this is not something you should not know about. It's important that you also know about it so that you don't utilize it in your study in the incorrect way. Because sometimes the research definitions of things can become confusing, and you use it not knowing it does not fit with your particular research study that you've chosen or your choice that you've made. Okay, so we're still busy with learning unit 3 as per the planner or layout that I've sent you, and we're doing theme 2, which is this evening focused on 2 lesson objectives. Number 1, we're going to discuss the relevance of a hypothesis to a study, and then we're going to justify where it fits or where it's not fitting for an intended study. So what is the relevance of an hypothesis is what the first LO asks us to consider. And I'm going to ask, just from your own understanding on the live chat, that you scan the QR code and just give me some insight from your perspective. What is an hypothesis? You can even tell me if you've used it before, where did you use it? And this is particularly related to research context. What do you know about it? Let's just do a baseline assessment of what you know about hypothesis before we unpack the content this evening. So more or less from your own understanding. So this is without looking at the textbook, without referring to the chapter, just generally when you hear hypothesis, what comes to mind. So I'm going to pause for a second and ask that you use the code, and just on the live chat, as was done in our first session, you're going to have anonymous responses that pop up. So don't worry, even if it's an incorrect answer, generally there's no incorrect answer. But if you do have an answer that's maybe far off from the others, it's anonymous, so you don't have to worry that we will pinpoint or know who it is. Okay, I've got one response that says an explanation of a phenomenon. Another that says it's a pre-existing theory of the issue. Thank you so much for the 2 of you. Let's see what the others are thinking. What do you think an hypothesis in research terms would mean? Must be based off an observation or a reasoning. Okay. It's a theory. It involves an in-depth investigation. It reminds me of back in high school, life sciences had investigations. We had to say what we think the explanation of a problem is before actually conducting it. Very nice, and I'm glad that it makes you link it back to your prior knowledge. It will help you distinguish or understand where are we moving forward with it in research, and you can apply the skills you gained from that life sciences investigation. So generally, what we mean by hypothesis, and you'll see when you do your own in-depth reading in chapter 6, It is a tentative statement. It's almost like you're making a prediction. In some cases, they'll say you're making an educated guess about something. And you'll say, if this happens, then that is generally the outcome. If the weather will change, we'll need to wear our jerseys. If the rain is coming, we will get wet. There's an impact of it. So it's generally a prediction you make of something that's going to happen. You are predicting an outcome. And it's used commonly in natural sciences or in the sciences based on what is testable. You would be able to create some kind of prediction and then test if it's true or not. You'll test if it's accepted or rejected at the end of your study. So everybody who has a quantitative study on this particular call, from last week's responses, we had 6 who said qualitative, 2 who said quantitative, and 1 mixed method. The students who lean towards mixed method and quantitative, from those who were on the call last week, the 3 students who are particularly identified or clear with quantitative and mixed method, you will generally have a hypothesis that's explicit in your study. And you will say, based on your title, in most cases, we can see that there are variables that the one will impact the other. There's a relationship between the two, where the one is a cause and there's an effect on something. When that is the case, it's generally a study that requires an hypothesis. And they've explicitly made it clear that when an hypothesis is needed, it is a quantitative study, a mixed method study, or generally an experimental design type of study. So for clarity on this, I'd like you to please refer to, I think it's page 93. And just follow through with me. And as I've said, even though majority of us are leaning towards qualitative study, we need to know what quantitative studies entail, that we don't mix it up in our writing. And also in future, when you do utilize it, it's not new to you and you don't have to study it all over again. And also that you can draw distinct lines, because sometimes it does become confusing. When do you use which sampling method? When do you utilize an hypothesis? Should I have an hypothesis in a qualitative study? This particular discussion will give you clarity on whether you can or cannot or should not. Guides the direction of the study, very good, and making a prediction of something, that's correct. Okay, so just for recap, it's a tentative statement. It's a statement that you make at the beginning of your study, and ultimately at the end, it will be proven to be correct or not, to be accepted or not, to be rejected, depending on the outcome of what you can or cannot prove. It's based on prior predictions that you perceive, that you think will happen, based on the literature that you may be going to read. And we are going to unpack that it's sometimes based on the theory that you find in literature, or it could be based off the laws that theories then form. So let's go over to that particular thing. On page 95, they discuss that theories, laws, and hypotheses are sometimes interlinked. When people speak about them, they almost speak of them in one synonymous, as if it's the same thing, and they are not. There are 3 distinct things. They're just impacted by the other. And they make it more complex in research. So you have to be able to, when you're speaking of theories, when you're speaking of laws, or you incorporate an hypothesis, you need to be able to distinguish between them quite clearly. So on page 95, I'm not going to read for you the entire chapter, but it is quite important that that theories part is understood, because both qualitative and quantitative studies make use of literature. And this particular chapter hints or alludes to what you should be thinking about when you write up your study and in which way. So if you look at it with regards to theory, it says the theories are based on evidence. Generally, when you're doing assignments, we'll say to you, use evidence to substantiate your answer. And you obviously know that means that you're going to search for literature to back up or to give you evidence for your study. So we know that here, theories are based on evidence. In your write-ups, you're going to have evidence in your literature review. You're going to have evidence in your theoretical frameworks. And these are all based on what other researchers have done before us. and we generally stay within the last 10 years of literature when we search for it. So theories are based on evidence, and there's two new terms that you need to dive into in your writing. These are words that have to be there in your proposal. It has to consider deductive or inductive approach. And depending if you're doing a mixed method or if you want to justify using both of them, you can. But if you look on page 95, something that is quite important for you to understand, that when we utilize deductive theorizing, or in theory, if we're going to take a deductive approach, it starts from the second paragraph, second sentence. You will typically formulate a theory and then the hypothesis that you want to test based on the theory. Here, you will then test the hypothesis against the reality. So you're going to collect your data to test the hypothesis against what you found in theory or in literature. And you're going to, based off the results, accept or reject or modify the original theory. So in this particular approach to theory testing, a theoretical assumption and concepts drive the collection, analysis, and interpretation of the data. The sentence that I want to get to that's important is the following one. The researcher consequently develops hypotheses to test whether there's a causal relationship between the variables from that particular heading or study that you are approaching. So quantitative studies, generally the authors of quantitative studies will identify variables. I'm not sure if how far back you have taught in first semester, but there are dependent and independent variables in a study. The one that causes something and the one that has an impact on it. The cause and effect that we just talked about, there's a relationship that generally in quantitative studies are considered. And if you consider those, your study will allude to the layout or structure that I just mentioned. So for deductive, we find the information first in literature. We're then going to collect our data. We're going to interpret what it says based on our own findings, and then test if that theory is correct or not. And then we make certain assumptions or modify that particular theory. Please take note of what deductive means and do a deeper dive for yourself to make sense of whether that is something you need to incorporate or mention in your study. There are then further subheadings that you need to consider. There's certain controls that you'll put in place, and then also operationalization as well as generalization of the data. Those three aspects should be unpacked and considered in your particular understanding. I'll come back to operationalization and generalizability of the study, but I want to go over to the next point, which is inductive. So you can see the inverse of it, the opposite of deductive. On page 96, other researchers are of the opinion that theory should be an outcome of the research process. And this is where inductive researchers look at. Generally, majority of us also look at this particular approach in our study. The researchers typically use more open-ended strategies that begin with observations and data collection. So here you almost start from the opposite. Instead of starting in literature, you collect your data first. They then look for patterns and regularly occurring events in the themes, and theoretical ideas subsequently emerge out of the data, and these ideas are used to build new theory based on the data. In this case, the theory follows the data. The method of theory building is known as inductive theorizing. So there's two theories that approaches you can take, and they're almost inverse of each other. The deductive approach is generally what we do the way we are taught. We're going to collect literature. From the literature, we're going to start to collect our data after we identified our sample. We're going to then take the data's results, interpret it against the literature, and then make our assumptions whether we want to prove whether the existing theory needs to be modified, if it is accepted or rejected. So that's generally how we write up our research. But you can also do it from the opposite inverse way, where you collect your data first and work your way back. I'm going to ask on the chat if you can indicate to me which option is your particular write-up going from. Is it starting in a deductive approach or an inductive approach? Are you collecting your data first, or are you writing the literature review first? Are we starting from literature to dive our way through the content, or are we collecting our data first? And I would ask that you would take a bit of a comment for yourself and take a deeper dive into this to find clarity and make the needed, have the needed conversations with your supervisor or with us in the next quiz that we'll have in our following session, so we can find clarity on which approach we are writing our write-up. So yes, we are writing the literature review, but not using an hypothesis. That's correct. Generally, in qualitative, we use the structure, but it's not quantitative in that sense. I understand what you are saying, so you're not using a hypothesis. The reason why I wanted to draw the distinction between these two is that you know about them and you justify your writing accordingly. So please make an asterisk or some notes for yourself and clarify the structure in which you are writing your research, and so that we can next week build on how do we justify the approach we've taken to avoid confusion for whether it's quantitative or qualitative. Okay, so based off that, we then have the laws that come into play. Now, a theory becomes a law, apologies for my typo over there, when the same thing occurs in the same way continuously. So in studies where researchers could show that they're going to get the same results if they do the same thing in the same way every time, then a law is established. It's quite difficult to establish a law, but if it has been proven over and over again with the same results, it becomes a law. And laws are used to describe things, but they do not explain why. It's based on the facts that you can find from that over and over factual evidence that you see. Again, on page 96 and 97, please read through that paragraph for clarity, but you'll see that although laws describe things, they do not explain them. Newton's law of gravity is an example of that, and we can use the law to predict that whenever we throw an object or a ball in the air, it's going to come back down because of gravity. However, Newton's law cannot explain what gravity is in a sense. This could be a discussion we could have to elaborate on, but in conclusion for this conversation, all that you need to take away from it is there are two new terms that we need to think about in theories, and a theory becomes a law when that is proven over and over again. There's facts that prove them. Now, why is this important or links to where an hypothesis comes into play? It's to give us clarity as follows, and I'd like you to perhaps underline or just highlight on page 97 when an hypothesis is required for your particular study. Now, an hypothesis is going to be crucial for the following. If you are doing a quantitative study or mixed method, you need to have a hypothesis, and your hypothesis will read anything such as, if this happens, then that will be the outcome. So if students fail when using AI, if students fail because of AI, possibly poor example, but I think you understand what I mean. Then it's also used in experimental design, as we've mentioned in the sciences. It's when you are making a prediction of something without having the evidence as yet. And it's the aim of your study when your study is explanatory in nature. Now, generally, when I started out with research, I was given two ways of looking at qualitative and quantitative studies. One is an explanatory study and one is an exploratory study, which can be confusing at some point, but if you understand or just align yourself with knowing, qualitative studies are generally explorative in nature. We've got where there's little insight and we want to get what people's experiences are, what their views are, their perceptions and their perspectives on something. Explanatory is when there's a cause and effect relationship happening and you want to test those specific hypotheses derived from theories from previous research to see if they are applicable for this particular relationship between the variables that we mentioned in order to understand the underlying mechanisms of something. So generally, hypothesis, if you are a bit lost or feel that it's too much, note that if you are doing a quantitative study, it would be expected of you to have an hypothesis. If you have a mixed method, it would be expected of you to have one. And if your study is an experimental design linked to sciences somehow, you would need to have one. And in that, you need to consider predictions that you are making at the start of your study. And next year, when you implement your study, you need to be able to say if you have accepted or rejected that particular study, if it has proven to be correct or if it is incorrect, and why. You are not going to lose marks if you are unable to prove your hypothesis. It's generally where we write it up as limitations to the study, as where there's room for correction or recommendations that can be made for future studies. So don't worry too much if your hypothesis could be proven to be true or not. We'll unpack deductive and inductive reasoning next week again, or inductive and deductive approaches. But can I just, for the sake of understanding, was deductive and inductive touched on during semester 1 at all? Just on the chat, if you can indicate for me if it was. The other chat, the live chat on Canva. I'll come back to the chat on Learn in a bit. We don't even know. No. Okay. So next week, when we do touch on it, I'm going to start off with giving clarity of deductive and inductive. It's quite interesting. I'm very passionate about that element because it will help you understand exactly how your study will unfold, and it makes it easier to unpack or write up the methodology section. So next week, we'll start with that, and I'll send you an announcement to ask if you could do some reading around it, so that when I put up my new authentic way of lecturing is just putting up video clips and speaking to it. I don't necessarily have words like I'm doing this evening. I'm trying not to scare you by just having videos, because some of us, we learn differently. So I'm adapting to have words on my slides this evening. But generally, next week, I'm going to have a deductive triangle and a deductive and inductive one. And we'll see the inverse of it, and you will be able to fully understand which one aligns with your study and then integrate it into your writing. Okay, that's good. If your supervisor explained it, that's also awesome. And even if you want to do your own self-reading about it, it's generally a word or words that need to be in your proposal. So do make a note for yourself to understand what deductive and inductive reasoning is. Okay, so in conclusion for this evening, we're going to discuss examples so that we can meet the lesson objective, and then I'm going to wrap up this evening. So let's consider a few examples and the appropriateness of a hypothesis in a study, and see if you are able to make the links or understand it the way I understand it. So we're first going to look at examples of when an hypothesis is not appropriate. So remember earlier on I said we need to know the difference between an exploratory study and explanatory study. An exploratory study is qualitative. So just by that first sentence, I'm alluding to the fact that hypothesis should not be used here. So in an exploratory research where the aim is to explore new ideas or phenomena without preconceived notions or forming hypotheses, because it might limit the scope of the discovery. You don't want to set a hypothesis in a qualitative study because you don't want to say if this happens, then that's going to be the outcome, because then it means you're just looking at those, the impact of what your hypothesis is set. You're not going to give room for the different experiences, the different ideas or responses from your participants. An example at the bottom, a qualitative study aiming to understand the lived experiences of individuals, for example, with a rare disease, would benefit more from open-ended inquiry rather than a predefined hypothesis. So generally, in all the qualitative studies and examples that I've seen over the past week from each of you, it is leaning towards qualitative for some of us, and there's an open-ended inquiry that would not be suitable for an hypothesis. The next one, where it's not suitable, generally follows an inductive approach where the goal is to generate new theories, where your goal is to have new insights from data. A hypothesis would not be suitable. The research is driven by observations and patterns that emerge from the data you're going to find. So a grounded theory, for example, that seeks to develop a theory based on participant interviews and observations. So the minute you're leaning towards using these data collection methods, interviews, observations, where people's voices are going to be utilized, you know that you are leaning towards qualitative and generally don't need a hypothesis. When the objective is to describe characteristics or functions of a phenomenon rather than to test the relationship or effects, an hypothesis is not necessary. So if you want to describe characteristics, for example, a study aimed at describing the demographic characteristics of a population, such as age and gender and income, you would focus on presenting that data rather than testing specific predictions for the outcome. So when is a hypothesis appropriate? I just included two examples. Number one, it's appropriate for a deductive approach where the goal is to test existing theories against the data you're going to collect. This approach often involves formulating the hypothesis based on the literature and then testing it through the empirical data that you are going to find in your data collection. An example is testing the hypothesis that increasing exercise reduces stress levels based on existing theories of physical health and stress reduction. So the minute you're going to use literature to predict an outcome against the data you're collecting, you're alluding to using a hypothesis. And then a final example, when a hypothesis is appropriate, hypotheses are particularly useful in quantitative research. So for all of you who initially said, I have a quantitative study, you automatically have a statistical testing numbers, quantifying approaches. And when you do that, when there's a measurement and analysis of variables, you definitely need an hypothesis. For example, if you're investigating the impact of a new drug on blood pressure levels, that can be framed with hypothesis predicting a significant decrease in blood pressure among the group that you are utilizing or collecting your data from, then you know you need an hypothesis. So I'm going to pause here for a second. Hypothesis on exercising is true. I loved it. I think we all at some point experience that. I just want to scroll down for your examples or your questions, and then we can wrap up as well. Okay, so just to touch base on a few of the examples that I can, or what I want to speak to. The first comment around the supervisor. So anything that we do cover, I'm not sure how frequently you touch base with your supervisors, but generally it would be great if you learn something new here, incorporate it in your research, and also touch base with your supervisor. Research is often subjective and it's seen through the lens of the person who sees the bigger study, your overall work. So we've done deductive and inductive. Next week we clarified. Do reach out to your supervisor, embed it into your writing. I'll indicate to you where you should utilize it. And then speak to your supervisor to see if in their perspective what you've written is correct. Just for clarity, for someone who asked earlier on, is lived experiences linked to phenomenological research? It depends on how you see it. If you are using lived experiences linked to, I'm not going to say the word again before my tongue does not allow it, but if it's used in a qualitative study, based on your understanding of experiences through those interviews, examining in the way you collect your data, then I would say yes, lived experiences is going to be considered because you are asking the participants their understanding based on the history of something or a lived experience. But if you are utilizing it through a qualitative study, it's a different perspective. I'm going to stop here and go back to you on the Learn platform, and then we can wrap up. Okay, so apologies, Noel. There's a live chat on the Canva app, and then there's a chat on the Learn platform. I should have been more clear on where I would want you to do your comments. Okay, so more or less we're going to find clarity around what works and what doesn't work. And we're also going to see which new concepts are brought in and where they fit into your own studies, so to speak. I'm going to pause for a second and ask on this particular chat. We're back on the Learn platform now. Are there any questions or anything you'd like me to clarify or just give clarity based on questions that you might have asked that I missed or something that you needed clarity on? Are you all more or less with me in terms of what this evening's lesson objectives were? Are you perhaps having a better sense, or are you a bit stuck on what hypotheses are and when they are applicable to your study? Or let me ask, like I ask my own students in the face-to-face classrooms, thumbs up if you at all walk away with something new or something that's clear. Thumbs down if you're a bit lost and still need to do some reading and have no idea what I just said for the past 45 minutes. That's also fine. It means that I will recap and we'll have another check-in run quiz in a different format next week, and we will then unpack. While we respond to my question based on what was covered this evening, there is a bit of uncertainty around task 3. So I just wanted to check base with you before we exit. When is task 3 due based on the PAS document? On the 6th of September. Okay, so there was a question from one of your peers around the date, so it's the 6th of September. Then there was a follow-up question to say, will we cover task 3? Because in my planner, I did not note going over task 3. So just for clarity and understanding, for your previous 2 tasks, anybody who's willing to unmute, would you be able to tell me, give me a sense, how was task 2 prepared? What did your lecturer generally pause for a second to unpack the expectations of the task here in this session? Or did she upload a live recording just for you to access it to get clarity on what you need to do? Okay. Okay. So based on my plan, I did not pause or even think about it. So the 2 students who did it, thank you for alluding to task 3. What I will do in my planner, I have not set up the time to incorporate it in discussions. But generally, I will load a recording to explain what task 3 is about. But please note, task 3 is slightly tricky because your supervisor on the other end is the person who should be guiding you to the expectations because they'll be marking it. So I'm going to give you clarity, or basically a summary that I will give my student whom I'm supervising. And based on the theory that you gain from this particular module, you have to listen to that recording, then prepare and unpack or pause at some point to interact with your supervisor. Now, I know relationship with supervisors can also be tricky. Some of you will have more support than others. Some of you will have, you'll receive instructions and still don't know what to do after receiving it. Because sometimes there's miscommunication in how we interpret what we need to do. So I'm going to upload a recording, and then after one of my sessions later in August, I'll pause it and finish 30 minutes earlier and answer all the Q&As related to task 3. But I don't have the time to cover it physically by reading it to you and going through the rubric. So that I'll do in a recording and I'll load it for you. You will then have to watch the recording by a specific date, and then by the session that follows that specific date, we will have a Q&A around what you understand and what you don't understand. And then you will also make enough time to meet with your supervisor to articulate if you're understanding what you need to do based on also their expectation on the other end. Yes, there's a chapter 20 that will discuss the proposal outline for you to be able to do task 3. So I will break that down in my explanation, and I'm glad that you have great support from your supervisors, and all that you will do is align what I'm saying from theory, link it to what your supervisor says based on what you're writing, and then you'll consolidate it to submit on time. But that's more or less how you will consolidate or put your task 3 together. Task 3 also builds on what you've done in the first 2 tasks to give you some guidance and clarity, and you'll stick within the page numbers and the expectation of that particular task. So I'll put that together just so that there's guidance from this particular module for it. But note that it's a two-way for that particular tasks. Those tasks are done in conjunction with what your supervisor is guiding you to do. Would it be possible to get a frame structure of how the proposal should look like for both qualitative research and quantitative? Yes, I can give you examples and I'll load it and I'll also touch on it in my recording for you. And then I'll load tentative guidelines for both. But I'm saying that also, Nozipo, with the same breath in saying your supervisor also will guide you through what I give you. So play open cards with them and don't take only what I give and follow it, because they might have specifics of what they want and how they interpret your study. So I'm going to give you a guideline that is generally used in this particular module for a quantitative study, generally used for a qualitative study, and I'll align it based on the rubric for task 3, the expectation for task 3, the limitations of that particular headings that must be there. Then over and above that, please liaise with, speak to, build those relationships with your supervisors to ensure that you're writing also to their expectation, because it will be different for each supervisor based on what they give you as advice to do within your study. So my particular student whom I'm supervising, I'll give her guidelines based on how I interpret what that rubric asks. And we do have generalized, standardized meetings where we align how we're going to mark, but that comes after the fact when you've already done your writing. So my best bet would be do your writing based on what I guide you in terms of theory, then unpack it with your supervisor to ensure that you consolidate both theory and practical elements for that final marking. I hope I'm making sense on this. Okay, I'm going to spend my weekend putting this video together and upload it for you. You have a month or 2, actually, not 2 because July is finished. You have a month to put task 3 together, and so that recording at least comes a month prior to you putting it together. So hopefully you still have a touch base with your supervisor to finalize task 3. So in conclusion, I don't have time to embed it in a lesson that's just allocated for task 3. I'm going to spend 30 minutes on Q&A because it becomes quite a different interpretation for all of us. So I won't go through what you need to do that I cover in the recording. You will ask me questions on what you need to do in a session. I'll put a date for you and I'll share it and give you a week to work through the recording before we unpack the Q&As for it. My advice, spend at least time in the week, every week, to dive into your study. My studies, I'm required to spend at least 2 hours a day on my research so I don't forget where I left off. I would halve that for each of you and say in your day, 30 minutes, allocate 1 hour to your study. At the end of the week, you can't let a week pass without still checking in with your study. If you don't, you'll do well. If you do leave it for weeks to pass, you're going to find yourself scrambling for where you need to pick up what you need to do. I think that's why they scheduled this particular module in a weekly basis, so you don't lose sight of where you are going. Okay, that is it for us today. I'm going to stop the recording and I'll be online for